Our speaker this evening, Paul Groner, is Professor Emeritus from University of Virginia. I first became familiar with his work in graduate school when his translation of the first volume of Hirakawa's work came out, and I gleefully read that, page cover to cover, and followed that, like many of the people in this room, by reading his works on Japanese Buddhism. Most of his research is focused on two broad areas of Japanese Buddhism. First of all, the study of Tendai, marked first of all by what remains the definitive study of Saicho. Saicho, the establishment of the Japanese Tendai school, and 20 years later, by the Ryogen and Mount Hiei book, Japanese Tendai in the 10th century. So that's one broad area of his research, Tendai. The other broad area of his research has focused on monastic discipline and ordinations, which he has researched in a whole series of publications, as well as in the seminar that he's offering to our students this quarter, entitled Precepts and Ordinations in East Asia. And throughout his work, from those first works I read in graduate school to the works he's most recently published, his writing is characterized by crystal clarity and just brimming with erudition. All of this makes him the most qualified person in the world to speak on the subject of tonight's lecture. What did it mean to be ordained in medieval Japanese Tendai? So please join me in welcoming Professor Groner.
So for those of you who've been to Japan or who have heard rumors about Japan, one of the things you would immediately notice if you went to Japanese Buddhist temples is that you'd be introduced to the monk's wife. He would, 90% of the time, he'd offer you some sake, so alcohol. Probably serve you some delicious fish or meat. In other words, it breaks basically all of the stereotypes that we in the West have of what monastic discipline is and what an ordination as a monk means. I think the study of Japanese Buddhism basically calls into question how seriously are those rules observed in all sorts of other countries. And the more you look, the more you find that, gee, it's constantly being reinterpreted. So this lecture arises out of I should give you a little bit of biographical information. As John said, I started studying this man on the left, Saicho, and he's the founder of Japanese Tendai. And what made him interesting to me is I wanted to see several things. What is the connection between Chinese Tiantai, the school which he sort of imported, and Japanese Tendai? And I also wanted to see why did he publicly and very officially reject the traditional Buddhist rules that monks had followed for 1,500 years. A while later, I don't think it was quite 20 years later, I worked on the guy on the left, the right, that's Ryogen. Ryogen takes the rough little school called Tendai, which really was not powerful at all, and turns it into, in a sense, the medieval Japanese equivalent of the Vatican. This is the school that really dominates Japanese Buddhism for centuries, even after Dogen's time. They will come up, but sorry, I couldn't resist. So what are those little things there that Jason is staring at? Those are tengu. Those are sort of like goblins. And if you look at Ryogen's face, you'll see some interesting things. He's not in a meditative posture at all. His eyes are wide open. He's controlling these goblins. And he's in his hands, it's hard to see here, he's got two things. One is a rosary, the other is a vajra, a weapon basically, that's used ritually. So Ryogen is basically a protector. I mean, he was a real person, but he was considered to basically be not much of a meditator, He probably did, but who knows. But really a defender of Mount Hiei. And it's in a sense that sort of juxtaposition. What did it mean to be ordained in medieval Japan? Certainly not that emphasis on meditation that you find popular amongst lots of Americans. So I want to show you some not really neat pictures about just ritual. They really don't have much to do with the lecture today, but they are so cool. So this is a classic Japanese Tendai ritual. This is called Hokedai, which means the Great Lotus Sutra Assembly. And what you have up there on the two people sitting up high, one's lecturing on the Lotus Sutra, the other is a questioner. Because as we all know, if you just listen to a lecture like mine, it gets pretty boring. So the questioner is supposed to ask questions to kind of, liven things up. And then all the other figures, they're running errands, they're taking notes, things like that. One of the other things you might notice is, if you look at the lighting in this, see the bright lights sort of coming through the shutters? This is what is actually called a yagi, a night ritual. So they do it in the daytime, but they pretend it's night by putting all the shutters there. And they do that because today they only do this every 3-4 years. They run literally hundreds of people through this ritual. Probably not hundreds, but a lot. After that, they'll give tests. And so the way you become an eminent monk in Japanese Tendai is you have to go through this. And on the left of the screen, you'll see there's an empty platform up high. So the person who's going to be tested climbs up the platform. Who's he facing? He's facing the Buddha. And he's being tested on doctrinal issues. And he'll be graded between 0 and 10 points, at least traditionally. Other things you find here is, again, lectures, exams are boring. So one of the things they started doing is they started bringing in little boys who they shaved their heads, which I think is kind of cool. And the boys did face-to-face debates, and they really get excited. The way in which you choose the topic, I've always wanted to do this for a final exam. The boy on the right is carrying a box, and you draw a stick basically with usually a 4-character phrase, and that's your topic. So there should be traditionally 90 different options. That's the way it was done a long time ago. Today everybody knows their topic and everybody memorizes the response, but still they're reenacting it. The other thing that is kind of interesting here is notice the boy has long hair. So he's not one of these so-called monks. He's almost coming out of a Shinto type tradition. Monks traditionally are supposed to wear rags that are sewn together to make robes. And you can see the monks on the left are wearing rags, beautiful brocades, which run easily tens of thousands of dollars, some of the best ones. On the right, you've got the boys, young men actually, who are going to be tested. They're dressed in white. If you follow Victor Turner and things like that, good liminal color, right? They're not wearing official robes yet. I just had to show I could do a little bit of that stuff. Traditionally, there's a high point when the Tendai leader, the judge of the thing, and the imperial emissary come together in palanquins, and they meet in the center. So they're still reenacting this 1,000 years after Ryogen basically set this up. So, there's the 3 palanquins, and they're being carried by Shinto priests. So again, that Buddhist Shinto syncretism, which today you don't get much of a sense of when you go to Japan, except you'll notice that next to most temples, there's a Shinto shrine. They used to be the same thing, or the same piece of property. So what does it mean to be ordained as a Tendai monk? basically means you're part of a group, you're part of an organization, the one that just did all the stuff I showed you. That was probably the most elaborate, most awe-inspiring ceremony I've been to. So I actually cut class when I was teaching at Virginia for a week, got one of my buddies, Dan Stevenson from Kansas, and he cut class too, and we both went to Japan for one of the best weeks I've ever had in my life. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do for the rest of this. Saicho throws out the traditional precepts, and in my first book I said, well, he did this because he wanted administrative control over his monks, so he substituted something else. He dies before he can explain what in the world he intended to do, and nobody knew. Literally, they didn't. You can look at all of his disciples. They're all over the map in their positions. So a very good friend of mine, who's probably the preeminent Tendai scholar in Japan, challenged me, and he said, okay, we'll do a book of essays on Japanese Tendai. You write the essay on Buddhist precepts, on monastic discipline, and I want you to talk about, not Saicho, because I know you can do that, talk about what happens afterwards. Buddhist scholars like me are pretty good at beginnings, and we're not nearly as good at taking things midstream and sort of explaining what's going on and how do we interpret it. So I spent a couple of years doing this. My essay for him came out about 2-3 years ago. The English original version of it is still not out, and who knows whether it ever will be. American publishers are slow. Anyway, so what I found I was dealing with was a lot of apocryphal texts, things attributed to Saicho and others that clearly he didn't write, and the other people didn't write either. It's very, very difficult to come up with a timeline for a lot of this stuff. And so what I had to do is come up with basically look at it in terms of sources. And that's kind of the stuff I've been reading with some of the graduate students here. In today's lecture, it's really my attempt to kind of explain to those brave 3 graduate students, or maybe foolish graduate students, what in the world I have in mind, because they just get little bits and pieces. So this is sort of pulls it together. So what I'm going to talk about is sources. And obviously I won't do all 6 of these in a lot of detail, but we start off with the Lotus Sutra. So if you're from Shinnyo-en, Japanese Tendai reveres the Lotus Sutra, and probably the next or the same degree in terms of authoritative text is Nirvana Sutra, but most of their theology, if I can call it that, is based on Lotus Sutra. So we start by looking at Lotus Sutra. Now, if you've read the Lotus Sutra at all, you will know there's nothing resembling precepts, in other words, rules for monastic discipline in the text. Watch what they do. If you don't believe in magic, you will, maybe. So this is a passage from the earliest biography we have of Saicho. And this is what it says. I'm just going to read the underlined parts. I vow that I shall forever abandon the 250 Hinayana precepts. And then he says, the great teachers of Nanyue, which is Huesa, and Tiantai, Juri, both heard the Lotus Sutra preached on Vulture's Peak. Since then, these precepts have been transmitted from teacher to teacher. Now, what does that text mean? Lotus Sutra claims that Shakyamuni is eternally preaching the Lotus Sutra. So when Huesa looks at Juri and he says, well, you know, we listened to this a long time ago on Vulture's Peak, he's basically, all he's saying is, we have a karmic tie, that's why you're here. This is like me looking at Paul Harrison, who I know reveres the Lotus Sutra, and says, Paul, a long time ago we listened to the Lotus Sutra on Vulture's Peak. Paul would tell you he doesn't mean that literally. Actually, he'll probably say some things worse than that. But Saicho takes it literally, and that becomes his the foundation for his lineage. Okay, then we go on. Okay, so long ago we listened to Shakyamuni preach the Lotus Sutra on Vulture's Peak. Huesa said that because of this past karma, you've now come. Then he showed him the Samantabhadra chapel, a bodhisattva, and explained the 4 comfortable practices. So what are the 4 comfortable practices? Moderately long passage in Lotus Sutra. But what's crucial is we will not use any Hinayana terms. And that's how Saicho's reading it. Now, Huesa actually writes a book which has been beautifully translated by my friend Dan Stevenson. That is a translation of Huesa's text. So all this text originally is saying is, we had this karmic tie, you came, let me show you this book I wrote, or at least explain the contents of it. For Saicho, this becomes, our lineage is founded on that, listening to Shakyamuni preach, and one of the things he preaches in the Lotus Sutra is you shouldn't talk or use Hinayana terms. And so this becomes sort of one of the ways in which Japanese Tendai will sort of read new things into what monastic discipline can be. A while later, I won't read all of this, but this is, again, an apocryphal text. This is attributed to Saicho, but he obviously didn't write it. Japanese Tendai monks believed he did for centuries, until about the 1800s. But they are asking, what are the precepts we're using? And the answer is we primarily rely on the Lotus Sutra. And then he gives you a number of different passages from the Lotus Sutra, none of which are really like rules. And then he goes on and he says, well, and we also rely on the three teachers, the witnesses, the fellow students described in the Sutra on the procedures for visualizing Samantabhadra. That becomes the basis for Tendai ordinations. So if you're a Tendai monk and you're in Japan and you're getting the ordination, who are you getting it from? You're getting it from three teachers, namely Shakyamuni Buddha, Manjushri, Bodhisattva who symbolizes wisdom, Maitreya, future Buddha. In a traditional ordination, you also have witnesses. Who would your witnesses be? The witnesses are all the Buddhas in the universe, according to this text. Who would your fellow students be? They're all the Bodhisattvas. So in a sense, you're being introduced into this almost ethereal sort of order of very powerful people. But they're invisible. How can these people possibly conduct an ordination? So we're, and a little bit later he says, secondarily we use the Brahma's Net Sutra, which is what the other text Saicho relies on. We'll look at that later. I might mention here, he also has a passage down here for, I did not add this because I'm coming to a Shinnyo-en thing, but Nirvana Sutra. So, let me just sort of find what I wanted. There it is. I wanted to show you, next one. This is the ordination platform, and it's kind of neat because what he has, we'll see if this thing works here. There's Shakyamuni, Maitreya, Manjushri, so they're up here. This is where your the person receiving the precepts would be, and then you've got this fancy stuff, special texts. Up here is what's called a Tahoto, a pagoda that symbolizes Lotus Sutra and so forth. So they're invisible. How can you do this? The answer is right there. There's a guy named the Denkaishi, means the teacher who transmits the precepts. So he's voicing all this stuff. Well, the others are sort of presiding over it. So the distinction Tendai makes is the Buddha confers the precepts. The head of the Tendai school transmits it. So, but then the problem you'd have if you were going to talk about, how in the world would this thing work? If you violate the precepts in a traditional monastic discipline, it's your fellow monks who pass judgment on you, who would decide what penalty to put on you or how you should repent for this. But here it's a bunch of precepts, bodhisattvas, Buddhas. Instilling monastic discipline is really a questionable business. Let's see how we're doing here. Okay. I'm just gonna, going to skip. So as time goes on, here's what we end up with for Lotus Sutra ordinations. And Japanese really were much more interested in ordinations than they ever were in the contents of the precepts of the rules. So Sonshun is one of the most eminent people of the 15th century, a really great Tendai monk. But look at what he's saying here. According to this lineage, this is a dominant lineage on Mount Hiei, there should be no ordination ceremony of the perfect precepts other than the 3 views in a single instant. Sounds pretty good. 3 views in a single instant means that at any given moment, I am recognizing that I Ding here is empty, or at least non-substantial. And yet, here I am using his name, so I have to give him provisional existence. I say, yeah, well, this bundle of energy is something I'll call I Ding, for lack of a better term. And then there's a middle truth. So if I were a Buddha, I'd see all 3 of those at once. So this sounds pretty good until you realize that what Japanese Tendai is doing, they have all these rituals where they're sort of conferring this as a ritual, not as really a meditative tradition. And you'll see that a little bit later. So we continue. This lineage maintains the position that the vehicles, teachings, and the precepts are identical, and that the 3 trainings, morality, meditation, wisdom, are non-dual. What is it that we refer to as the true essence of the perfect precepts? It's simply to adhere to the Lotus Sutra. Oh, okay, what does that mean? You memorize it, you chant it, you teach it to other people. The 3 views in a single instant are found in the term wondrous dharma, myoho, and if you've been around people coming out of Nichiren-based organizations, you know the chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. So that Myoho is the first 2 characters for the title of the Lotus Sutra. And then he cites what you could call a proof text. Where in the world is this idea coming from? And he takes this sort of passage, which probably most people would just read over, and he says, according to the sutra, Lotus Sutra, this sutra is difficult to hold. If you hold it even for a short time, we call it holding the precepts. And when I've done this lecture in Japan, a lot of Nichiren people come up and they say, yeah, that's basically where we're at. So we can talk more about some of this. Let's see. I'll just talk about one more ritual and then we'll leave Lotus Sutra behind. So this is something called Consecrated Ordination. So there's a passage in the Lotus Sutra which I've always thought Steven Spielberg could do a wonderful job with. Shakyamuni says, this is my last teaching, pay attention to it. And then it turns out it's not, because all of a sudden you have a reliquary come floating out of the sky. This is really Steven Spielberg stuff, right? Well, it's a reliquary. There should be nothing but ashes in there. But the doors open, and there's a fully formed Buddha who's alive, sitting in there. And he's calling all of his manifestations. And then Shakyamuni climbs into the reliquary, and they sit side by side. So in East Asian Buddhist art, whenever you see 2 Buddhas sitting side by side, it's Lotus Sutra. But in this ritual, the teacher and the student sit side by side under a canopy, and they go through a series of 4 gasho. And the last one is this one here. Their arms are intertwined. Their foreheads touch. Okay, so far so good. The part I don't think I could ever manage to do is the soles of their feet touch. In other words, it is a ritual where they're saying, yes, you... I tried to imitate that, Jason, and my friend thought I was making a pass. And then the teacher draws a reverse swastika on the student's chest. They exchange robes. All of this is just about having faith. Faith that, yes, you are the Buddha. Yes, you are the same as your teacher. And this would be done after a long period of practice originally. It's still performed in Japan. I've written about it. People won't show me the ritual. So a lot of this stuff is still secret. And when I was doing this and I showed the gasho, a very good friend of mine says, how can you show that? I said, well, it was published. Oh, it's been published? Okay, no problem. So anyway, Lotus Sutra and Precepts, but it's really Lotus Sutra and Ordinations are really, really interesting. So the next source, major source, I'll spend most of my time on the first two sources in case you're getting worried about time. Saicho, in other works, says he's going to substitute what we call the Brahma's Net Sutra precepts. These are 10 major precepts, 48 minor precepts. So these are a lot of rules. And he's going to use those to fully ordained monks instead of the Vinaya. Well, this set of precepts was used in China constantly, but only after people had received various sets of precepts specified in the Vinaya. So if you were a lay person, you'd receive 5 precepts, then you could receive this. If you were a monk, you'd receive the novice precepts, the full 250 precepts, then usually you'd receive Bodhisattva precepts. So if you want to read about this, Holmes Welch's wonderful book, The Practice of Chinese Buddhism, has a very detailed discussion. I wanted to give you one example of a Brahma's Net precept, and you can see how odd this is. This is the very first one. So as you might expect, the very first precept is one that says you shouldn't kill. And we'll just look at the stuff underlined. One may not purposely kill any living thing. A bodhisattva should give rise to eternally abiding compassion, be filial and obedient, and use all means to protect the living. If he conversely kills out of greed or anger, this is a parajika, or a major offense for the bodhisattva. It's a really interesting precept because I think American Buddhists probably would really like this. But look at the problems with it. A bodhisattva shouldn't purposely kill any living thing. Okay, what if I swat a mosquito? Is that the same as killing another human being? If I ate nachos last night at Treseder, and I ordered them, is that the same as killing a human being? Clearly this is a very problematic precept. And if you start reading commentaries, which I really sort of enjoy doing, what you start seeing is they're saying, no, these are not all the same degree of offense. You must make distinctions. And the source for making those distinctions, it's the Nirvana Sutra. So they're constantly using, looking at other sutras, such as the Nirvana Sutra. But it also continues to get odd. So it says, if he conversely kills out of greed or anger, but what if he kills out of compassion? What if you're that person who says, gee, there's Adolf Hitler. We won't use any contemporary living people as an example. If I were to shoot him, I could save lots of people. That would be a compassionate sort of thing to do. And there are passages in Buddhist scriptures that deal precisely with that issue. So all of this is desperately calling out for commentaries. And Japanese Tendai monks, except for a few people who I really like, who you'll be introduced to a little bit later, most of them are saying, nah, we'll just talk about ordinations, that's okay. So it takes a couple of centuries before you start getting people seriously writing commentaries in Japan on this. I'm sort of jumping ahead because I okay, whoops. So we finish Lotus Sutra Brahma's Net Sutra with this thing. Ninku is one of my favorite authors. Again, a medieval sort of Muromachi period thinker. Incredibly interesting, studied by maybe one or two other people in the world. So he argues that, in fact, Japanese Tendai monks need to take those precepts seriously. And he does it by saying, these are not inferior precepts, these are perfect precepts. And by perfect precepts, he means they are part of the highest teaching. They are universally applicable to everybody. So the place where you'll find Brahma's Net Sutra precepts really being discussed in some detail is really in Ninku. So I thought I'd just give you some example. He does debates. He has monastic debates. We just talked about those earlier. So one of the things about Japanese Tendai is it gives rise to Pure Land, to Zen, to Nichiren. How could it give rise to those schools that dominate Japanese Buddhism later? And it's because they were a great educational institution. So in terms of debates on precepts, these are fairly typical. Which is superior, the Lotus Sutra, the Brahma's Net Sutra? Traditionally, you'd always say Lotus Sutra. He's going to make arguments that they're equal. And what's fun about reading this debate literature is there's no right answer. So different students are coming up with different explanations. And he does really pays a lot of attention to the argument that no, Brahma's Net Sutra is not the same as, shouldn't be considered to be the same level of truth as Lotus Sutra. Is someone who's received the essence of the Brahma's Net precepts free from bad rebirths? So this is one of the promises, as you find extravagant promises in lots of Buddhist scriptures. And he wants to say, yeah, probably. How could we prove that's not the case after all? Is the essence of the Bodhisattva precepts physical or mental? At first that sounds really like an odd question, but look at what's at stake here. If it's mental, you don't need to go in front of anybody for the ordination. It should be enough if you just think it to yourself. If it's physical, what they mean by that is not physical in the sense of I can touch it, but you must go in front of certain people with your body and mind, and you must recite the proper ritual statements. So at stake here with that sort of funny little question is, what's the importance of an institution? After all, if it was only mental, all of you grad students in here, it'd be enough to just think, I should be a PhD, and poof, try getting a job with that. Anyway, lots of questions like that. We should talk a little bit about esoteric Buddhism because Tendai is famous for this, and I'm just basically going to look at this passage here. So this is Anen, a Tendai monk who we're currently reading in class together. This is what we should be reading next week. We might still read it anyway. So this is the way the passage goes. According to the secret determinations of mantra, the Brahma's Net precepts are the shallow and abbreviated teaching of the Diamond Peak Sutra. So Diamond Peak Sutra is a basic tantric or esoteric Buddhist text. Secret determinations of mantra, if I remember right, are written by Vajrabodhi, one of the great Indian esoteric Buddhist masters who comes to China, translates things like that. And here he's, in that text, Vajrabodhi is saying, Brahma's Net Sutra precepts are shallow and they're abbreviated. They're not very good. So he would have come to China. He'd look at this Brahma's Net Sutra, which is an apocryphal text. It's clearly written in China. And he thinks, this is no big thing. So he says this. For the most part, his evaluation is ignored until we get to Anen. And then Anen cites that passage repeatedly. I mean, he really puts Brahma's Net Sutra down and doesn't think that much of it. So what would you have instead? And he says, well, he continues, in contrast, the precepts of the Bodhisattva canon, Pitaka, refer to the Samaya Precept. So these are basic precepts, which is, my friend Yiding will tell you, Samaya Precepts didn't really mean precepts, but here we're translating it that way, of all the Buddhas. These are the basic, almost so abstract vows, for lack of a better term, that all the Buddhas make. And then he says, from those esoteric Buddhist Samaya precepts, then going out in concentric circles like a mandala in other works, he's going to talk about closest to the center, that's the highest. You go out, then you get others. And he talks about how the precepts become elaborated as you go further and further away from that center. So the locus classicus for a lot of this stuff is what's called Mahavira Sutra, even though here he's citing Diamond Peak Sutra. And then he goes and he switches. Anand's constantly switching texts. It says, long ago Shakyamuni Bodhisattva practiced for 6 years, classic Buddha Shakyamuni biography, and then sat in the place of enlightenment. This is the Bodhi tree. And he failed to realize supreme enlightenment. All of the Buddhas came and they conferred the Samaya esoteric precepts on him, and then he realizes it. So what you've got here is this is like esoteric or tantric Buddhism's declaration of independence. What they're saying is, all that stuff you guys have been studying, it's not ultimate. We have the ultimate. And so Anand is sort of picking up on that. Now think what this means in terms of an ordination for a Tendai monk at that point. So traditionally, as I start off the lecture saying, what did it mean to be ordained as a Tendai monk? It meant you were part of the group, you were part of this Tendai organization. Now it's being conflated with realization of Buddhahood in some sort of sense. So let's see if we can figure out a little bit about what in the world that might have meant. We'll skip that. Okay, so Anand's in sort of using that ordination with two different sort of Tendai teachings. One is something called realization of Buddhahood with this very body, which is, everybody thinks Kukai had that originally. Saicho had that same concept at exactly the same time. Who had it first? There's no way to tell. They're using completely different sources, but they're both fascinated by what in the world does it mean to be a Buddha, gain Buddhahood right here with my body. For Saicho, what he's going to look at is the story of the Naga girl in the Lotus Sutra, and I don't have time to really tell you much about that, so I won't. So he's saying ordinations are like that, and then he identifies them with another classic Chinese Tiantai teaching, 6 degrees of identity. And what that says is, all of you right now, in fact, everybody on this campus, in some sense, is a Buddha. You may never have heard about Buddhism, but you are a Buddha. Pretty stupid one in most cases. And what Saicho's doing is he's sort of doing a hierarchy, and he's showing with this 6 degrees of identity how you go from not realizing that you're a Buddha at all to practicing and finally gaining full realization. So he's going to use this to classify teachings. And we'll just look at one or two of the things he says. According to the Sutra on Perfect Enlightenment, all sentient beings have originally realized Buddhahood. This refers to identity and principle. In other words, a person doesn't even know it, he's never heard of Buddhism, but they have that Buddha nature, as it were. And then second lowest, according to the Brahma's Net Sutra, if sentient beings receive the precepts, they enter into the ranks of the Buddhas. This is the most famous passage in that whole text, much more famous than any rule that text has. This refers to verbal identity with this very body. In other words, he's saying, now you've heard it. So whether you've practiced, whether you've done anything with it, at least you've been exposed to Buddhism. That sort of karmic seed, as it were, has been planted. And then at the very top, as you might guess, once again, the Lotus Sutra. And what they keep doing with the Lotus Sutra is they pull up things that are, we would read through and we'd say, we'd ignore them. So according to the Lotus Sutra, in the instant he hears this, he is able to thoroughly realize supreme enlightenment. This is entering Buddhahood with supreme enlightenment. It is for those with the highest degree of faculties. And then he continues, thus you should know that the rules of the precepts, or the precepts, the rules of the perfect vehicle, are only the realization of the fruits of the path. They're the realization of Buddhahood with no recompense for violations. So all of a sudden, if that's where you're at, you can kind of make up your own rules. Okay. So right now, things are completely screwy. So we have to bring it back to earth. And so they did that by using the Vinaya. This is the text that Saicho supposedly rejects. But if you don't go back to that, you don't really have the institutional basis for a lot of things. So, several key things. Saicho allows for provisional Hinayana ordinations after a person has practiced for 12 years. This proves to be completely unworkable. Most monks won't stay on Mount Hiei for 12 years. Who wants a provisional ordination anyway? But at least Saicho was sort of recognizing in his statements to the court, we need something. Tendai reveres this man Ganjin. Ganjin brings over the Vinaya and traditional ordinations to Japan. He also brings over the first Tiantai or Tendai texts in Japan. So they've always sort of liked him, but the Japanese Tendai feels a little bit ambivalent because they kind of reject his tradition, but they still honor him. So what we're stuck with, and what later Tendai exegetes were stuck with, is how do we interpret those precepts? So I gave you one example, and you saw how it was kind of pretty vague and confusing. They had to use Vinaya texts to sort of talk about this. So what does it mean to have a fortnightly assembly? The term appears in Brahma's Net Sutra, but is never explained. What does it mean to have a rainy season retreat? So traditionally, Indian monks were supposed to have a 3-month-long retreat. If you completed that successfully, you got 1 year of seniority. It was really important to do that. What are the rules for eating? Can you eat in special groups or not? And they were constantly importing these things and trying to figure out which can we use without becoming too Hinayanist. So one of my favorite Tendai monks, I have lots of favorite ones. There's a man named Enshin. And Enshin lives a little bit after Saicho, not very long after. He spends 5 years in China. So if you know it, have a sense of Chinese Buddhist history, you will know that in 845, there was a disastrous persecution of Chinese Buddhism. And the Chinese actually lost a lot of their texts. They later had to re-import them from Korea and from Japan. So he's visiting there, with less than a decade after this, and he sort of looks at things and he thinks we have to revive this. And then he's going to go back to Japan afterwards. He's going to serve as the head of the Tendai school for one of the longest tenures of anybody, over 20 years. And he's going to try to strengthen monastic discipline. And this is a complaint he makes. He starts by saying the novices of this country, the Shami, are mostly devoid of Buddhist teachings. Now that usage of terms is interesting because he's calling his fellow monks novices. He's not calling them, he knows the difference. So this is really derogatory. They do not know the 6 types of mindfulness, do not observe the rainy season retreat, do not go to the hall for the fortnightly assembly, do not understand the rules for the 2 robes, begging bowl or cloth for sitting. They have no shame. How are they different from lay believers? There's a guy writing, about almost 1,200 years ago. And today a Chinese monk, a Korean monk, a Theravada monk goes to Japan. He might also repeat that. How are they different from lay believers? So I sort of introduced this just to give you a sense of how problematic a lot of these things were, even to Japanese. I mean, when Japanese write about monastic discipline, they're very serious about it. They're trying to figure out, are we really Buddhists? Are we monastics? What are we? And as a result, I think the literature is really quite interesting. Enshin brings back all kinds of Vinaya texts just to show you that this was not an idle interest by this man. Let's see, how are we doing time-wise? I'm going to go through a bunch of this. Last thing for Vinaya, and then we'll go on. He writes a number of sets of temple rules. This guy was not only a great scholar, he was a great administrator. The two usually don't go together, except at Stanford, I think. But here's a list of the things he writes about. These are all classic Vinaya things. And he's saying, this is what my new monks, newly ordained monks, this is what they should know about. They should have those 6 types of mindfulness. They should know about the correct number of robes, fortnightly assembly, proxies for meetings. In other words, in the event you cannot attend something, you are supposed to account for yourself. You send a proxy, and so forth. So they're constantly, as you might guess, Japanese Buddhism is swinging back and forth between very lax interpretations and very serious interpretations. What's the difference? It's who the abbot is of a particular temple. Get a strict abbot, yeah, people will behave. And you get a lax abbot, and things are going to spiral downwards. We'll let you think about which type of abbot you would prefer. I wanted to just talk a little bit about precepts as intrinsic to meditative practice, just to sort of come back to that. So this is a really weird passage from a text that is usually considered to be by Saicho. I think the text really is by Saicho, but this one has always bothered me, and I've never been sure about it. So the underlined part is Saicho's going to meet a Tendai master. It's a man named Dao Sui. And Dao Sui transmitted the 3 views in an instant. Remember, we've heard about that. With a single word. What in the world would that mean? And he conferred the Bodhisattva precepts with complete faith. So the truth is, Japanese Tendai monks had no idea what it meant to confer the 3 views in an instant with a single word. Didn't stop them. They devised all kinds of rituals to do exactly that. And they sort of ignore the last part of this, conferred the Bodhisattva precepts, or the perfect precepts with complete faith, until somebody comes along and he says, what about that? We should do that. And then they start conflating the two. 3 views in an instant equals Bodhisattva precepts, which we saw when we looked at the passage by Sonshun earlier, who postdates this by quite a bit. And then you get a whole tradition of faith is really important. What's the teacher and the student doing when they sit and they reenact that scene from the Lotus Sutra where the 2 Buddhas sit together? That's all about faith. How do I take a student and convince him that, yes, you are a Buddha. This is not just stuff that's written. Maybe you're not fully realized, but have faith. So the whole theme of faith in this literature becomes increasingly important. Okay, I was told to talk for about 50 minutes. I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of this. Oh, this one's fun. So this is, again, a person who's trying to revive the precepts. And he's the man who also devises that ritual where the teacher and student sit under the canopy. And so his teachings, he has a diary, and he talks about his dreams. So he has a dream, he meets his teacher Egi and Saicho in the dream, and he explains his views. And they ask him about him. And then Koen, the hero in this, says, the significance of the precepts lies in using the phenomenal to master the principle. In other words, you're using everyday things, phenomena, to master the highest principles of Buddhism. It is the observance of the prohibitions on not killing, not stealing. If one focuses on the letter of the rules and their observance, then one will master the origins of the principle and will return to the direct path, Jikido, to enlightenment. Jikido is another term that Saicho introduces. He's sort of always looking for terminology. They will later talk about observing the precepts as realization of Buddhahood with this very body. So they're constantly playing with these ideas, going back and forth. What does this mean? The rules for such everyday activities, such as using the toilet for each day and night, are generally like this. They are precisely the rules for the realization of Buddhahood with this very body. Sentient beings all fully embody the three uncreated bodies of the Buddha. Furthermore, they are not worldlings who transmigrate in ignorance. However, during a day, they are constantly attacked by the three poisons and five desires, so they forget that their minds are innately pure. It goes on like that. A lot of the stuff I'm showing you was only published in the last 20 years. So for a long time it existed. I mean, you could find it in manuscripts that were hard to read. And I remember doing some of that. It was the most time-consuming thing I've ever done. Okay, last part. This won't take too long. So how do we know what people actually did? Well, for the most part, we don't. But one of the key things you'd want to look at are temple rules. And again, what's going to be crucial is who the abbot is. If you've got an abbot who's enforcing these, they're going to be important. If the abbot isn't enforcing them, then they're not going to be important. So what you end up doing is you look at publication records, you look at colophons for manuscripts to try and get some sense. So this is a set of temple rules, just excerpts. It was written by this man, Ninku. And Ninku sponsored things like debates on the precepts, that type of thing. So I throw this in primarily for the graduate students. When students are between 15 and 50 years of age, I think you all are, one should not discriminate among them according to whether they're smart or slow. One should not discuss whether they are able or not. During the 2 periods when they listen to lectures and study, they should not be late in assembling. Stanford students are rarely late. I'm impressed. When they're over 50, then they're old. And we should not add rules. Whether they come or not depends on their own will. Okay, then his tradition was teaching a variety of things. Tendai Shingon, by Shingon he doesn't mean Kukai Shingon school, he means Tendai Esoteric Buddhism. So Tendai Shingon, the perfect precepts, and Pure Land are the 4 traditions that we study. As for daytime lectures, invited people give some of them. Other lectures are given by people invited by Shinnyo-en. I wrote that last part in. Each of the 4 teachings should be expounded, but they should not be mixed. That's really important. Don't mix them. Why is that important? Because if you study esoteric Buddhism, it will tell you, if you recite this Dharani, you can get rid of eons of bad karma. So if that's what you believe, why would you observe the precepts? And similar problems with Pure Land. So he's saying, keep them separate. They're all part of Tendai, but it was important to him that you understand where you were at. At night we study. This consists of quiet reflection on the meaning of the texts and should be conducted so that neighboring monks are not bothered, whether it's esoteric or exoteric, whether it is the way of sages, Pure Land, the study of traditional Buddhism, or Pure Land. Students should study what they wish. They may study in groups. And elsewhere, I did not include it in this, he'll say, and if you want to meditate or recite Dharani, that's okay, but don't do it very loudly and don't disturb anybody. He's convinced what they're about is academics. And thank you, that was a nice interlude. He will divide the types of temples they have into 3 groups, sort of groups that, it's Mapo, it's Mofa. It's okay. So he'll talk about 3 different groups of temples. One focuses on Chan, so on Zen, so Zen groups. He'll talk about others that are more focused on Vinaya, and then he talks about groups focusing on teaching. And he's gotten this classification from Sung Dynasty Buddhism. He doesn't really know the details of what's happening in China, but he's using it to go to the government and say, hey, Tendai is teaching. You should recognize that. You should support us. Don't keep supporting all those Zen temples. The other thing I wanted to just mention very briefly is these rules have punishments. And that was important to have punishments. So if you violate the rules, what happens? Well, the assembly decides. In bad cases, they could use how would you translate it? Brahma Danda, I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But it's basically translates as ostracism. So supposedly in Brahma's heaven, when a god is not behaving, they stick him up on a pedestal and everybody ignores him. And so he was saying you could do that. You could make people pay for writing supplies. You could, in other words, use fines and so forth. And of course, you make them embarrassed. Anyway, that was how I dealt with this challenge from my good friend Okubo Ryoshin as to what in the world was going on in medieval Tendai. I never could come up with a chronology because I don't think there is a chronology. Everything was happening in different groups. So one of the things this showed me is when we study Japanese Tendai or Japanese Buddhism today, we'll frequently talk about something called Kemitsu Taisei, which means this monolithic establishment of esoteric, exoteric Buddhism, which Kuroda Toshio, who devised this, used to get Japanese historians to pay attention to Buddhism. But seen from the inside of Buddhist schools, it's bullshit. Tendai was all over the map. There was no monolithic thing. I have to come up with something inspiring just in this. So let me just say this. Why do I get excited about this stuff? Well, my kids would tell you I'm just strange, but and they're right. But what strikes me about Japanese Buddhism is Japanese were not sure what Buddhism was, at least what monastic discipline meant. They weren't sure whether it was okay to have a mistress or to drink. At least the most serious ones weren't. The vast majority said, yeah, it's okay. So the literature that I read comes out of, it's almost entirely from serious people. The ones who thought it didn't matter, they don't bother to write things. If you want to know what warrior monks thought, I've never found any good source for that. But the serious ones are really interesting people who I find fascinating to study. So thanks a lot for coming out.